Fellow Rotarians and guests, and thank you for joining us today for another important program, Building a Better Community, Justice Reform. Since we temporarily moved our meetings and programs to virtual 4 months ago, we committed ourselves to the importance of programs that were timely and relevant to the moment we are in. And today's discussion is just that. But first, I want to personally thank our members and leaders going back many decades for positioning this club with the technology, the reputation, but most importantly, the ideals of community and civil discourse. Similar to our programs, the Downtown Rotary Club of Sioux Falls continues to push forward with the Sioux 52 Mentoring Initiative and are gaining new members who want to be a part of an organization that is focused on doing important work in its community. If you are a member and want to get more involved, please reach out to me directly. And if you are interested in becoming a member, please message us. I'm going to now turn it over to Rotarian Vaney Hariri, who will moderate today's discussion about justice reform between Sioux Falls Police Lt. Jon Thum and newly elected Minnehaha County State's Attorney Daniel Haggar. Thank you.
Hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in to Sioux Falls Downtown Rotary, and welcome to our Building a Better Community conversations. With this conversation focusing on justice reform, I'm Vaney Hariri, co-founder of Think 3D, Rotarian, and I am your moderator today. You're probably used to me sitting in one of the other seats, but in an effort to expand the conversation and to make sure we're moving towards action, we want to make sure that we include all of the important voices and the affected voices in these conversations. And today we have a few guests that are very important voices in terms of the conversation of justice reform. I'd like to welcome back Sioux Falls PD Lieutenant Jon Thum, who has been with us, so you know a little bit about him, but also our incoming Minnehaha County State's Attorney, Daniel Haggar. And we want to learn a little bit about you because we know a little bit about Jon. So why don't you just go ahead and start us there and tell us a little bit about yourself, Dan.
Yeah, I guess a brief introduction. Thank you for having me here. Glad to be a part of this. Appreciate what you guys are doing.
Thank you.
I was born and raised in Sioux Falls. Grew up here. I grew up in the house that my great-grandfather built when he immigrated here from Lebanon about 120 years ago. Mm-hmm. That's a fun thing to do. It's a fun thing to just see our community growing, see all the great things that we're doing. I was able to, play soccer in the soccer fields that, I drive by and now my kids are playing on them. Went to the University of Sioux Falls for undergrad. Had some good professors there. Wonderful people. It's a good community. I went to the University of South Dakota School of Law, now the Knudsen School of Law. Again, just seeing and living in the community that I grew up in, seeing those awesome changes and people investing back into it. I love this community. My wife and I are raising our kids here. Super excited to have been elected state's attorney. I know it's going to be a lot of hard work, a lot of hard topics, but I'm up to the challenge.
It's a big gig.
Yeah.
it's a big gig to it. Well, and I think we probably take for granted that the average citizen really understands what the role is in terms of state's attorney. Why don't you give us a little background on that? So what are some of your responsibilities? What are some of your duties? What are some of your authorities as a state's attorney?
Yeah, good question. The state's attorney, there's really a civil and a criminal side to it. The civil side will be giving advice to the different county government departments, so kind of acting as a lawyer that tells them, okay, this is legal, this is not legal, here's what you need to look out for when you're doing that. Could be during elections, certainly giving the county commission advice while they're conducting their business. That's an important role. That civil division also handles abuse and neglect proceedings with children who are abused and neglected. They'll prosecute juvenile offenses. I think what people probably think about and is in all reality the lion's share of the work that the state's attorney's office and the state's attorney will do is prosecuting state crimes. Right? Anything from speeding tickets up to homicide, our responsibility is to make sure that justice is being done in those. and this is where maybe I can pull Lieutenant Thum in, if you just very briefly explain what happens when the arrest happens, what you send to my office, then I can expand on that a little bit. I think it'll be helpful.
So as we've talked about in the past, the front door to the criminal justice system is really law enforcement, right? And whatever that encounter may be, from a speeding ticket to a homicide, there's some measure of report or recording that's done that's then given to the state's attorney for review. Some very simple stuff, a report can go directly, if it's arrest made, to the state's attorney's office for review. Some of our more recent investigations have been pretty complex. A couple homicides, a couple armed robberies, just within the past couple weeks. Well, here's where you see law enforcement and the state's attorney working really closely hand in hand to make sure all the I's are dotted, T's are crossed, going over warrants, going over reports, and really working with law enforcement to make sure we get all the little details right that make the case or whatever's going to happen is well documented for the state's attorney to take it to that next level, which is either a court trial, a plea hearing, or anything else that takes place in that nature. I think the relationship between law enforcement and the state's attorney is key. Is obviously in a lot of different situations we have to have that open line of communication to make sure we are doing everything as appropriate and by the book as possible, because we work in that together. But sometimes as law enforcement we understand that we may have this incident or this case, and the state's attorney, ultimately it's their judgment, their prudence as to what goes forward with that moving forward. And I learned very early as an officer that whatever happens in court, you don't take personally. That's your part of the job, is to get that to the state's attorney's office for further review, and they take care of it from there.
Yeah, so once we get those reports, those tickets, once the case hits my desk, or any of the deputies who are working for me, we're going to do a review over that and say, okay, here's what the person was arrested for. We have the legal knowledge and the experience, and that's where we're working, so we can say, okay, maybe we should add charges. Maybe we should not proceed on these charges. I have ethical responsibilities as a prosecutor. There are ethical responsibilities that govern all lawyers, and then there are special rules for prosecutors. A prosecutor cannot prosecute a case on which they do not believe that there's probable cause. Okay? So when I get those reports, I need to read through that with that idea in mind. I'll file charging documents, a complaint and information, lets that defendant know, here's what we're alleging, here's what we're saying you did, here's when we're saying you did it. They will have court dates. If it's some of those higher crimes, some of the felonies, we will present those to a grand jury or a judge and say, here's some of the evidence that we have. This is why we think that there was probably a crime that was committed, and it's probably committed by this person. So there will be a review that we are presenting evidence to either that grand jury, which is citizens, kind of a smaller jury than what would be at a jury trial, or those judges. That's an important step. It's important that we're exercising our discretion with what we put in front of them, and how we're doing that. Ultimately, if we pass that hurdle, we could end up at a jury trial. We'll have plea negotiations with defense attorneys or with defendants, but we will represent the state at a jury trial and ultimately at sentencing if there's a conviction.
So how does that balance work? Because obviously you have to work in conjunction with each other, PD and the state's attorney, obviously helping to make sure that the cases are appropriate and firm and well produced. At the same time, there's obviously some accountability that has to happen there if charges may seem aggressive or if something is happening in the process. How do you guys balance that relationship and how you engage with each other while keeping that kind of professional space?
Yeah, what I've done in prior cases that I've prosecuted, if I thought that there was more evidence that I wanted to see if we could find, like whether it's more investigation, if there's something that I thought, okay, maybe we are getting close to violating the law and could lose this evidence to suppression, I would call the officer. I'd talk to him and say, okay, what were you thinking? What were you seeing? Because a lot of times they'll have perspective that I won't be able to see in the reports or won't be able to see in the video. So sometimes that communication can show me exactly why they did what they did. If evidence gets suppressed by the court, because it was unconstitutionally obtained, again, that's a conversation I want to have with the law enforcement officer and say, okay, here's why the judge ruled this way. How do we make sure we don't get back here?
Yeah, but as an officer or detective, that your report or your initial observations aren't necessarily going to be the final story, right? Again, I may see what are the charges that apply for this. Let me go look at statute. Let me see what's there. And then, but there has to be some trust with the state's attorney, because we also understand that everything we put forward isn't going to be handled exactly the way it is on paper initially. The state's attorney has to look through that, look for what bigger issues are at play, and decide, okay, you know, I've got numerous personal anecdotes I won't bore you with at this moment, right? But there has to be some trust there, you know, because a lot of times it's just, we understand that the courtroom is their area of expertise, and they know what's best, and they need to push forward with what they need to and get the information they need from there.
Absolutely. Well, let's dial it back just a little bit, because, you know, when people think about your positions in general, really the topic is normally around crime. And,
Yep.
and crime is always a popular topic, but it feels like whenever we do talk about it, it is either the standpoint of being naive, or it seems hyperbolic, right?
Yeah.
It either, you know, either everything is roses or we're going to hell in a handbasket, right? So draw us a line for you to, in your own words, where do you feel like we are at in terms of crime?
I'll start, because like I said, I'm kind of the front door here a little bit, but you talk about the whole naivety of it, right?
Yeah.
The naivety of crime. And so I even run into this with my family members to this day. They're like, oh, did you have a busy weekend? I suppose with all the Christmas shopping, it was pretty wild around the mall. And I'm like, no, there was a homicide, an armed robbery, numerous other things that happened. There's a little bit of a naive approach sometimes, and even I was guilty of that. When I first got out of college, worked sales, I'm like, I'm going to become a police officer, right? And in my mind, I was like, oh, what are the primary functions of a police officer? Probably go to a couple calls, maybe handle a couple speeding, you know, issues, stuff like that. I'm like, no, it was not what I thought it was. I had no idea what was taking place in my own neighborhood.
Yeah.
I was really naive to the fact that, okay, this is going on out there. Now, to further that a little bit, the whole naive thing, I think sometimes there's some fear mongering that, oh yeah, this is going crazy here. We've got escalating this. And I can say in my career, is crime, do I notice things are different? Absolutely. But I also notice that they're representative of a population that's exploding, right? Is the city gets bigger, the metro area gets bigger, it's just basic mathematics will tell you that incidents will go up a little bit, things will occur at a higher rate. By no means am I saying that it's an epidemic. I say that anecdotally, especially recently, violent crime and gun crime are something we see a little bit of uptick in. Which is why we do so many PSAs. Where's the PSA camera? Don't leave your guns unlocked in your car. Leave your guns secured. Because again, we hit so many times now that people are just not, you know, carelessly getting their guns taken out of their cars, right? So, but again, all this stuff works together. The metro area grows proportionately. Our population goes up proportionally. We see an increase in crime just based on those alone. So,
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what he's saying. When you look at our community, people are moving here, right? Crime isn't out of control because people are still wanting to come here. They want to live here. They want to work here. They see the good things that our community has to offer. If we were having some of the problems that other communities are having with crime, people wouldn't be flocking here like they are. That being said, drug use is going to be an issue, right? You know, that is increasing. The problem is that people make bad decisions when they're under the influence of some of those. You know, so some of that violence can stem from that. COVID will have an impact on what crime happens in our community. You know, as people become desperate from not having a job for, you know, months, that desperation can lead to them thinking the best choice that I have right now is committing a crime. So I think that we're going to see that. Unfortunately, that crime kind of increase as we deal with the aftermath. And, you know, we're really not even out of COVID yet, but I think that that's coming. And so I think it's going to take some hard work to deal with that and maybe some creative approaches.
Absolutely. We'll just even get into that. Let's maybe look at how we think about our justice system in general, because one of the things that we want to do is get beyond the idea that it's just police.
Yeah.
We all know that is one part of a very, very large machine that is our justice system. And there's some things for me that are just interesting about how we just think about it, you know, especially coming, I hope, out of this kind of just crime and punishment era of thinking about things. But what would be your assessment on the justice system in general?
Yeah, let me start with that one again, and I'm going to sound like I'm harping on the same thing, but COVID is going to absolutely, and it already is. I think that the criminal justice system right now is already being affected by COVID in a way that will be hard to deal with. You know, when you had just the slowing of what was happening in the court system, you know, so typically you would have, you know, jury trials, all these hearings happening, and COVID stopped that for a period of time. We're now getting to the point where we're starting to restart what normal is. But when you talk about a backlog of jury trials, those are going to have 60, 70 citizens coming in for each of those to sit on a jury panel. It takes judges, state's attorneys, defense attorneys, and we're backlogged there. The Minnehaha County State's Attorney's Office, you know, has 10,000 open cases. That's a high caseload. Fortunately, here's the good news. We have a lot of hardworking, very competent attorneys in that office. They're going to be able to get through that backlog. Yeah. But when you talk about taking things that should have been happening months ago and now adding that to the mix now, time is a resource that is valuable in the state's attorney's office. So when you talk about everything being pushed off 3 months, now you have good state's attorneys who have a lot more work to do. And when they have too much work, that's not a good thing for the community, for sure. Right? We need them to be able to exercise their discretion, to exercise it in a way that they feel confident making the decisions. And so they're going to have to be efficient. And that's a reality. You know, we are backlogged.
Yeah. If, you know, from the bigger picture of the justice system, I think you'll find many people within it that will be frustrated by it, right? From the police officers, from seeing the same people again and again and again, from the state's attorneys, from the never-ending caseload, and again, many times the same people again and again, from victims who sometimes don't see justice served, from people who have been arrested, seeing trials delayed and things pushed out in representation issues and things like that. So a lot of what people experience can be frustrating for them. And I think what we're getting at the bigger picture here is what are we doing within that justice system to try different approaches and do different things. And I think, and we'll see from our courts that we have right now, from DUI court, vet court, drug court, just different diversionary programs. I'm probably missing some other specialty courts where the justice system is partnering with the individual, oftentimes the offender, right, to work towards a better end so we don't see that recidivism, that same old character again and again and again. Because I'll tell you, from a law enforcement perspective, if I look back at my recent months, which have been very active, a lot of the major cases and people we're dealing with are repeat offenders, right? Early in the justice system, I don't pull up a history for them and see, oh, this is their first entry.
Right.
I see 20, 30, 40, 50 multiple entries that have brought us to this point. And I think that's the bigger picture is looking at some outside the box stuff. I can, in fact, if you want to do another story, it'd be really interesting to get some of our alternative court people involved, where they partner with prosecutors, with defense attorneys, and work towards getting a different look at the justice system rather than just here's where we're at right now.
Well, let's talk about that because, you know, I think one of the things is that is part of the new approach is adult diversionary program. You know, as we talk about, and that's one of the things I want to get into is the human aspect of this, because I think we have this conversation sometimes out of the aspect of dealing with humans. And one of the things is that we know that hurt people and happy people don't, right? And so when we see young people, I think most people understand the need for diversionary programs there, the need to help people who have had ACEs in their lives or been the victims of trauma or haven't had the type of guidance or leadership in their lives. But what I've come to find is that oftentimes we care about kids until they grow up. And if we haven't interrupted that trend, if we haven't interrupted that trajectory, why would we be surprised that we're seeing the same behaviors in an adult that we were seeing in this troubled child? And so we have used diversionary programs, and we do have some different courts now. But let's just talk a little bit about the idea of adult diversionary programs and how you might approach that, or what your philosophy is on that.
Yeah, I appreciate that question. Lieutenant Thum is right with the drug court, the DUI court, then the mental health and the veterans court. Those are maybe a little bit earlier sometimes than those DUI and drug courts. But those courts, when I look at them, I'm glad with what they're able to accomplish. Those are happening later on in defendants' lives, right? It could be someone who has 6, 7 DUIs, and they're looking at a lengthy penitentiary stay. if they're not successful in this court. It is admirable to be able to help that person and hopefully, save 7, 8, 9 DUIs, right? We want to stop that. I do think that there's a gap in between juveniles and those courts.
Yeah.
One of the things and one of the visions I have for the Minnehaha County State's Attorney's Office, and I've talked about this before, is trying to find a way to set up an adult diversion that maybe addresses some of those earlier offenders. When they come into contact, letting them know this is your fork in the road. If you keep going down this path, you're going to keep meeting the lieutenant, you're going to keep meeting me, and it's not going to be a fun life. It's not going to be productive. It's going to harm our community. It's going to harm the people that you love. It's going to harm your children. But if we can find a way to get them to re-engage, and, there's going to be hard conversations that, have to take place.
Yeah.
They have to accept responsibility. They have to understand that this is not how to be a good part of this community.
Mm-hmm.
I will look to, create a program that gives them opportunities. They're going to have to work at it, right? It's hard to be, well, it shouldn't be hard, but it can be hard to be a productive member of society. They have to do that. I think that we owe that to the people that we're sitting here, the people that we're talking to. And so any program that we have, they have to understand, I'm a part of this community. How do I make it better?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, there is a two-way street. And again, we talk about, if you want to see an enthusiastic group of people, like some of my coworkers, I've never sat on the law enforcement advisory of these diversionary programs, but they're absolutely enthusiastic about the members of these courts, right? One of my co-lieutenants was so proud talking about this DUI court guy who had accomplished all these different things. And I think that enthusiasm is shared amongst the entire group that participates in that, because they recognize, well, here's how we get some positive change in individuals' lives. Again, come back to this, we can't corporately change everything. We change individuals. We don't change entire groups by waving a wand over them. And again, a new approach or looking at different ways to do things. But ultimately, again, the community and different groups can have to be met halfway by the other party to say, okay, let's partner together to go forward and get this rolling. Because again, by the time they're 20, 25 incidents deep in our history log, we're probably a little too late to really make some effective change. It's going to take a wow, aha moment, rather than early on saying, here's the reality of your consequences. The reality of your consequences is the biggest one who stands to lose from your choices is you. Right? Because it's your future you're determining. And when I talk to young kids sometimes who are even younger, I'm like, they all really think that we have a vested interest in what happens to them. And we do as a community, but individually we'll all go about our lives. Right? I'll go home to my family. You'll go home to your family. You'll go home to your family. And the choices you make are really going to be affecting primarily you at this point. But the community as a whole, I don't want to be lost and say the community doesn't care about you. The community does.
Right.
But your individual choices are ultimately going to become reflecting on you the most as far as the consequences.
Well, let's drill down on that a little bit, because I think that's so important as we talk about the justice system in general, because I think sometimes people are detached with the results. And I think that affects the context of how much appetite you have to do these type of programs. Like if you were under the impression that the justice system was running the way we want it, and people go through, they're reformed, they don't come back, they change their lives and they do that thing, and it costs less than if we did this. But in many cases, the way we operate now costs more. It's twice as much per inmate than it is per student. We have a situation where our recidivism rate is one that I think we will all agree is unacceptable, even though it's lower than the national average. And so we have people coming back at an immense amount of expense, a lot of time, energy, and effort, as you pointed out. And so what do you feel like the appetite is, or just where your position on the idea of again, changing that idea of just being tough on crime, right? And not thinking about the human piece of it, and getting to the point where we say, we want this person to be made better. That's really what the point is. The idea that a crime is a moment in time versus a class of human, or that justice is not necessarily just what you do to the person who committed the crime, but rather the victim of the crime. What do you do for them, Right.
Yeah.
What do you think about these kind of prevailing ideas right now in this moment as people are looking for a shift in how we handle justice?
That question, essentially what you're asking is, what is justice?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That's a hard question to answer.
No, philosophy, like that, maybe about 18 different answers. Yeah.
It matters who your prosecutors are. It matters who your judges are. It matters who your defense attorneys are, because what needs to be considered in each case is, how much retribution do we need? How much rehabilitation do we need? How much deterrence? How do we get to that?
Yeah.
It's a hard question to answer, and it has to be individualized. I can't sit here and say every time this person does X, we will do Y, and then we will get Z. That doesn't work. But I can't sit here and tell you if we have X and we do Y or Z, then we'll get the best outcome. But you're right. There are collateral consequences for everything that happens. If I say, okay, in this case, the right thing to do is to send this person to the penitentiary, there's going to be a cost to their family that the family didn't deserve. But that individual brought themselves to that point.
Right.
If I'm cutting a break as a prosecutor, I may have a victim who says, that's not fair, that's not justice.
Right.
It's hard. There's a lot of moving parts.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Everybody should spend a day in court, because I think everybody has this mindset that when a judge sits over many of these cases, it's a very regimented, stiff exercise, right? I learned very early on, and this judge is no longer on the bench, but I was sitting as a young cop, and they're going through case after case after case, and this isn't like a major case, I can't remember the exact name, but they're, either doing continuations or stays or pleas on minor cases. Well, a judge sitting up there, and a young lady comes up in one of her first offenses, and the judge bends over backwards to extend her time, give her more time to get into counseling, drug alcohol assessment, all the different things that the court asks of people. And I'm like, wow, this judge is incredibly compassionate. I didn't know court really worked like this. As a young officer, I'm sitting there. And he goes through, is kind, gives all these words about what his expectations are of her. And really, in this situation, I'm like, wow, that's a neat restorative justice piece there. He's working towards something that's better than her current situation. Next person came up, all right? And the judge honestly was not too impressed, because guess what? He's been there time and time again. And the judge said, I gave you this extension this time. I did this, this, and this on this date. He goes, we're done now. Right? So the judge, with very similar circumstances, is going to use his discernment and his personal history and experience with these two people to decide at that moment what's the right course. So I think when people think sometimes that that's not happening at all within the justice system, that there's not grace given, there's not restoration or a chance for restorative justice, I think that's not always the case, but there are some times when consequences are handled by the judge. But again, as a whole justice system, how do we look at that? And I can even tell you from my own experience, early on in my career, I got my nose broken, got assaulted as a police officer, and I still can't smell to this day, which is in many cases really good as a police officer. In many cases really poor. You know how sometimes they call the dog to come sniff a car? Oh, yeah. I got to call a smelling officer to even smell if there's anything going on, right? So, but it works in other ways too. So the suspect who did it smashed the victim with a table leg and destroyed his face. And then when he got a hold of me, broke my nose too. And very early on, I'm like, okay, state's attorney calls me like, well, we're going to give this guy a plea deal, right? This guy's going to have a plea deal. We're going to give him 6 months for resisting, 6 months for simple assault on law enforcement. Yeah. And I'm like, okay, well, you're wise, state's attorney. Go ahead and do that. Well, guy gets that minimal sentence within 6 months. He's out, does an armed robbery of a casino, right? Within 6 months, goes to the pen, comes back and does another armed robbery when he gets out of the pen a second time. Now, long story, but it helped me put myself in the shoes of that victim, right? Right. So I'm a law enforcement officer. I'm still a victim, but I'm a kind of, in many ways, the society looks at me as a different kind of victim. But sometimes the frustration of the victims within the justice system is very real, where some of these graces and some of these, and then see this happen out again and again and go in there. So it's really, we try to make it, everybody knows it's complex, and then we try to simplify it to a certain degree, but understand that each case is very, very different. And between the victim, the suspect, and all parties involved, the opinions are very, very different on a case-by-case basis.
For sure. Maybe give us some insight on that, because as we talk about this, of course, it's not a layup, and you get to a certain point where people, what else do you do, right? I think what a lot of people are looking to be thoughtful about, or I think could learn from, is, what are all the things that are available? Because I think if sometimes the position is, this is the way we've always done it. This kind of is what it is. We know that in a lot of pockets, people are really doing some really interesting and creative things, some that are working, some not as well. And again, to take it beyond the lens of just your positions, what are some other things down the chain that might be able to help this thing, right? Because the idea is not necessarily just charging someone or not charging someone, putting someone incarcerated or not. It's also what their experience is while they're incarcerated. What does their re-entry situation look like? And just, if you could help us get into the ripple effects of these type of things. Because when we talk about our local economy, people as workforce, when we talk about family structure and that person not being in a family, what does that mean for that young person that's in that family? And what does their trajectory look like now? And I just really would like for us to get into those ripple effects a little bit, and those other pieces to the pie or puzzle that might help people get a little bit more context.
Yeah, certainly with criminal offenses, when they're committed, they plead guilty. We can fashion our plea offers. The courts can fashion sentences towards, rehabilitation. I could say, okay, I'll cut you a break as a prosecutor. I won't ask for this much time, or I won't ask for time, but you have to go through treatment. There's a lot of different treatment places in our community. We can utilize the 24/7 program. We say, okay, you prove that you're staying sober during these periods of time, you could get a break. There are a lot of creative ways that you can fashion plea deals or sentences. We could have community service attached to them. I'm interested in seeing them, gain mentors and start having positive influences in their lives. I think that that's something that would certainly help those individuals. But if I say, okay, you have been caught with methamphetamine for the first time, second time, stop doing it.
Right.
That doesn't really set them up to succeed.
Yeah.
So there can be some creativity with, and maybe it's not that creative, but there can be things that are attached to the plea offers and the sentencing that I think can move them towards being productive in our community.
I think that's part of it. I think, like, when people think of the part that we all play when we talk about being tough on crime, is like the idea that it's throw the book at them or just let them go, or just do whatever. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, and I think that's kind of the thing. It's like, whether it be treatment, leadership development, mentorship, other cognitive therapy, or community service, or being able to engage. It's just this whole host of things that are able to affect the human, and not just because we're just being kind of heart, even though I think that's a good motivation, but also just because in many cases treatment works better, or works better and it's less expensive. Not always, but so maybe you could talk a little bit more about that.
When you look at that, and it's we kind of look at the criminal justice system maybe to solve all the issues that are involved, right? Well, sometimes what some of the best benefit you see is at the end of all this road, right? It's either a community group, it's Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous. A couple of the churches have recovery programs now that they host, where people who have just got out of jail, who look at different addicts or different other ways of addressing these core issues that are causing all these problems, right? So again, if I just pat somebody on the back and say, hey, well, you did your 6 months in county, good luck to you. I'm sure meth is no longer an issue for you.
Yeah.
Right? Go. But no, we know that's not the case, right? Just one of my own acquaintances from way back in college is, I think, on his third or fourth time through rehab now, through methamphetamine. Because I'll tell you what, methamphetamine, awful drug. But then we can't lose sight on alcohol either. Right? Alcohol drives a lot of what we do.
Yeah.
Like, is law enforcement, our day-to-day problems are really alcohol too. And I think if we're not pushing as a society. Society has a lot to say on how we handle these situations.
Yeah.
And society can say, okay, and this is kind of how we are where we're at right now. Society says, cops, you do this, courts, you do this, and here's where we're at. Well, now society can look at it and say, how do we really further address some of these issues? Because again, for whether it's the offender to the family, and it all kind of loops back to what did we talk about the previous couple times we chatted about mentorship and being involved and finding ways for the society, community as a whole to reach out to these people that really need guidance and help. And again, work from that end. However, knowing at the same time too, that there is going to be recidivism. There is going to be frustration. There is going to be relapses, but we never give up on that. We keep going back to rehab, or we keep putting the shoe back on. Even if we fall back down, we got to get back at it again, right? Because it's never over until you give up on yourself. And so we keep encouraging people to keep that fight up. Because again, it is undeniable, especially the effect methamphetamine has on people, where you just can't walk out the door and be done with it. Like that's a naive expectation. Yeah.
And I think it's also important to remember, the courts and the state's attorneys, we can't solve every problem, because at the end of the day, that person will, be released from custody, or they'll be released from probation. You can't always have, the mean state's attorney telling you have to do this, you have to do this. They have to get to that point in their lives where they say, okay, this is how I'm going to be better. This is how I'm going to get better. And that's where, having a community that supports them helps them do that. You're not always going to have the judge saying, if you don't do this, you're in trouble.
Right. The carrot and stick is very limited in what you can do with that. So let's do this. Let's do our PSA straight to camera. Let's start with you, Lieutenant Thum. What do you want from the community? What is the help that you want? What do you want society to do to step up? Because we don't ever really get to hear that part.
No.
We don't ever get to hear it to say, okay, I get what you want from me.
So
here's what I want for you. Go.
So as society, we can look around individually and see what our sphere of influence is. And we can say what we're involved in and what we're not involved in. And again, it comes back for me time and time again. If you're looking for something to pour into the community or a resource, it's in some mentorship, especially for youth, and how to support families. We keep coming back to, again, the impact on families when people are taken out of homes. Well, what can we do, not just to support the kids, but support those families? And I know within numerous community groups and churches and other initiatives through LSS and other places, there's opportunities and outreach for that. Again, by the time you're a 25th time in our history sheet, we've already lost too much ground on getting into that point where we can mentor and help people. But if we start early and start often, and I think we can have a more impact with the problem, as opposed to just dealing with it way down the road.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. When you have people in your lives that friends, neighbors, family members, when you see them hurting or you see them struggling with things, come alongside them and make sure that you can be supportive, help them. If you don't feel comfortable doing that in an individual capacity, connect with a group or connect with an organization who's working towards those goals. I think that's what's important, because the police, the state's attorneys, the judges, they won't be able to affect every person. But you can say, okay, here's my sphere of influence. Here are the people that I see. I can communicate with them. I can know when they're struggling. I can see what's different. Just come alongside them.
Yeah, I think that's so important. I'm glad you guys, shared that piece of it. A lot of times we just act like these things are just, some type of just sickness that comes over a person in the moment and they commit a crime or whatever. And we don't see it sometimes as being trends. We don't see it as being circumstances. We don't see it as being all of these touch points that people have. I think it's always strange, after a major crime happens, a serial killer or a bomber or something like that, and people say, I just never saw it, and it's one of those things where, especially where, we can tend to be a garage up, garage down type of community at times. And how do we just get more engaged with each other and share the responsibility of being in each other's lives? And sometimes it's not always best if you're minding your own business. Sometimes you need to go and make sure that your next door neighbor or your friend or whoever is okay, and prevent these things on the front end through social means. Yeah.
And I think, again, too, as we get older and we get more mature, we kind of understand that that's within our power, right?
Yeah.
I'm 40, right? And I've matured along the way. And if I much more better at having a hard conversation than 22-year-old me was, right?
Right.
22-year-old me might have really struggled to say, hey, I really think you have a problem with alcohol. Or I really think that some of the anger issues I'm seeing from you are really a problem and you might want to talk to somebody about it. Right?
Yeah.
Right. Even my closest friends but now as you mature, you get better at that. So how do we as a community encourage young people too to confront each other, maybe not only on the positive aspects of life, but also the negative aspects of life? Hey, I really think you maybe shouldn't drink and drive. Like some accountability within your groups and work towards that end, because I think it's very easy to shift it off to somebody else's job. But again, we're a little bit older, a little bit wiser now, and the generations coming before us are going to repeat the same things that happen unless we maybe encourage them or prompt them, mentor them to be, allies and help each other out through circumstances.
Yeah. All right. I want to zoom out national a little bit, hit you guys with a couple ones that are less issues here now, but we know that, as our population grows and these type of things increase, it could be a little bit different. In a national conversation, when we talk about justice reform on the front end, particularly in the areas that you all are in, there are some really big prevailing themes that people really want to see challenged. One is overcharging or stacking charges as a strategic method. The other one being bail and how that's managed with people and how that affects people from a socioeconomic aspect. And then the idea of resisting arrest as a standalone charge or issue, the idea of kind of comply or die type mentality. There's a whole lot of more that we could talk about.
You got another hour then?
Yeah, right. Right.
Yeah.
But I just want to touch on these things, and I don't expect you to answer for everyone, but I think it's important to have some context to it and talk about the philosophy piece of it. So let's just talk about the overcharging piece of it or stacking charges. Now, obviously, that's starting from the officer and establishing what those things are in our statutes. And I think sometimes when we see a lot of the videos that are happening, there's just two things that are really that usually stick out to me as I review it. One is the idea of a person asking, hey, what's happening? Why are you doing this? The other one is the commentary that we hear from people quite a bit, which is, this may not have happened to you had you been nice or had you been respectful, had you been whatever. So there's a perception, I think, from some that the way you get charged really based on how that officer feels about you in that particular moment, and
Sure.
So can you just speak to that component a little bit?
So from every call you go to, every component's a little bit different. There are expectations on certain calls. Let's say it's a domestic, that you will charge this. It's against state law not to charge with this. And then some of the subsequent charges that come along with it in relationship to that victim, whether it's interruption of 911 services, resisting arrest because now I'm making contact with you and going that direction. So that's one case. Another case can be entirely different. And I think a lot of times when what we have strived to do and be better at is just a piece called procedural justice, which you don't always catch in the video, right? If I catch this little 30-second clip, it's kind of the chaos of the moment. But being really good at trying to explain why this is happening, what's your recourse moving forward. All right, here's the reason why you were charged with this, and this. Here's the reality, though. We're not the judge. We're not the jury. I've used this many times. I go, we're the front door to the justice system. The state's attorney and the court will review these cases, and they have the ultimate say. I usually say because they're wiser than us when it comes to these, but that's their role within the justice system. I think a lot of times it's important to understand that there is some flexibility within certain charges, and we'll see it exercised sometimes. Sometimes there's not flexibility, and sometimes when you are arrested, the charges that meet the criteria of those probable cause elements are put within that report. And then it's for the state's attorney to decide, you know what, we're going to drop this charge. We're going to drop this charge. Here's the charge we're going to present to the grand jury. The grand jury will look at this and then move forward. I think ultimately it's important for people to remember that the time to argue what's happening is not necessarily on the street. Like the courtroom is the venue to argue that, because many times understanding comes after the fact, when emotions have died down, when things have kind of de-escalated a little bit. That's when more clear heads and quick, concise means can be used to work through these charges. But yeah, we're very working within our what we present to the state's attorney's office, to each interaction that we have, that we be as transparent as possible. And again, that's a class we give when we try to teach, that many times I can calm the situation down by explaining, well, Vaney, here's why this is happening today, right? It is state law that I arrest you for this. Also, you were driving drunk and hit a car. I simply can't let you go with that, right? You know, or this is a citizen's arrest. This citizen is arresting you for this charge based on this signed complaint. And I'm under my due exercise of what I have to under state law. I have to exercise this, right?
Yeah.
Right. So there's a lot of explaining that can be done. But again, as with many things in life, communication is key. Mm-hmm. Some of us are really good at communication. Some of us are not so good at communication. And we need to communicate with each other to make sure those facts are known. But again,
I'd like to circle around back to that about the idea of using a conversation as a tool, particularly being on the street. But I think, as you said, when you guys shifted over, I think a lot of times what gets lost in the conversation in terms of a person being willing to accept what's happening in the moment is the faith and trust that they have, that they do have a recourse after the moment. Yeah. And going back to number one, internal affairs is usually, it's vertical. It's, it's in the organization, it's police, judging what police are doing in many cases. And the other component to that is state's attorney's office, which has to work in close conjunction with PD. So where would a person get the confidence that when I leave this moment, right, that when I deal with this in court, all of these people who work together are going to somehow say, nope, that officer was wrong. You were right. Where would I develop that confidence from?
Well, that's a good question. I can't deny that there are people who have gone through and experienced that. I can't say, no, there hasn't been injustice that has happened, right? And that can really poison the trust that that individual has in the criminal justice system. But that's why I think accountability matters. That's why it's good to have, elections for state's attorneys. It's good to have good judges appointed, because ultimately, you either trust your justice system or you don't. I can't just say, I hear what you're saying, but trust me. You have to trust me.
Right.
I have to follow that up with the right action. I have to make sure that what I'm doing is ethical under the law that governs what I do. I have to make sure that when I'm advocating for things, it's what I should be advocating for. I think accountability matters, and having conversations can make a difference. But it's hard, right? There are some people that are, they're never going to agree that we have a just system.
And there's a few people that will fall into that category. But one of the things that we, I know we talk about a lot is, it's not just what you do, it's what you undo. There's a lot of mistrust for no cause of yours in many cases, but it's there and it's prevalent, and it affects your ability to be able to do your job and your ability to be able to do your job as an extension of that. So, how do we start to go about healing that particular piece of it? Because I'll tell you, there's situations where, officer can stop me now here, and I'm gonna do the whole thing. No problem. Because I feel like I could actually pick up the phone and really be able to have whatever I'm going through be taken seriously. So compliant is not a big deal for me because I really legit feel like somebody. But if I don't feel that way, why are you putting cuffs on me, right? So do you have any ideas of some things that we could do to bridge that gap and develop that trust?
It is impossible to not have national events impact local events. It is naive to think that's not going to happen, right? And so as much as we can say, we're not a national police force, what happens there doesn't affect police department XYZ, doesn't affect here. State's attorney's office or DA or whatever they call them in another jurisdiction, right? Doesn't affect what happens here. It still frames people's contacts, right? It still frames what comes together. And so again, we have to just, be constantly working on building trust locally, highlighting what we're doing locally, and if mistakes are made, taking account for them locally as well, right? And being open and transparent about it. But again, I wish there was an easy button on this, right? I wish there was something that you could just say, oh yeah, here's something everybody will be comfortable with and it'll work this way. But again, it just like we tell officers, we're like, remember, none of this is personal. And I think sometimes people think that officers go out there and like they take everything personal. Like it's personal. It's not personal. It's professional. Like what we deal with, you can be extremely upset with me because I'm arresting you, but this is what I'm doing right now because it's the professional me that's doing this. This is nothing me personally against you. This is the facts of the case and the probable cause that's presented in front of me. And we work towards that. And we have to be able to deconstruct these events and look at them from start to finish. But again, we don't always get that luxury.
Yeah.
Right? We get the snap reaction. We get the 30-second video. We get the anecdotal evidence from somebody else. We get all this stuff that rolls in and gets our emotions rolling on both sides. When we really have to just say, okay, society ultimately has a say in how police police and how courts court and how judges judge and everything that goes together. Let's make sure we're listening to what society's saying and have society work towards that end. And again, we've talked about this time and time again. If society wants to see something different, then let's work towards something different. If it's something, a different diversionary program, a different way that police could approach something. We're trying it with mental health. We built, again, with our serial inebriates, we built a multi-million-dollar facility that houses 20 people that everybody thought was the craziest idea ever. What is it?
Yeah.
It's worked out awesome. Like we've impacted people's lives with the new triage center, who's the link, right? Let's see where that goes and where that affects. But again, we can't we have to just work towards trust and accountability with each other.
Even that's a big thing though, because I think in the public, a lot of times, I think people perceive asking you to do something different or wanting you to do something better or whatever is an attack, is somehow not supporting you. And I think what I constantly hear from people who are in the system all the time is to say, we're going to do the thing you tell us to do.
Yeah.
So if you want us to do something different, you have to tell us to do something different, you know?
Yeah. And like we've talked about before, if you told me as a police department, I could get rid of going to these calls now, these either, let's just say serial inebriate calls. If you told me, yeah, we don't want you to do that anymore, show me where to sign, right?
Yeah.
Because there's really nothing more frustrating as we've seen with the Heritage Park issues and stuff like that, where we really can't impact change. We can do the enforcement side of things, but that's not changing and making a positive gain. So if somebody wants to help out and come alongside and say, you know what, cops, you sit this one out, right?
Yeah.
We're going to try this approach. By all means, we know we'll be there in some way, shape, or form, but let's look at alternative resources and alternative ways to approach things. We know we just can't get rid of everything in general because, again, recent facts have told us with multiple homicide, multiple armed robberies that police have plenty of work to do. And we've been very effective at solving these recent cases. And for as much as I think people want to look at law enforcement, we've been pretty successful at wrapping up numerous bad incidents that have happened in town right lately, too. And we want to be able to maintain that high level of service. But again, we've talked about it. Yeah. Come alongside. Let's look at some new approaches. I'm all for it.
Let's do the thing.
Yeah.
Also, I wanted, if you could, just to touch on the bail situation.
Okay.
Again, I haven't been privy to a whole lot of accusations of us being, predatory or anything like that, really in that space. But as a national trend, it is a big part of the conversation and how bail plays a part in terms of how people are pleading, in terms of their socioeconomic situation. What's your philosophy on that? Rather than answering for what has happened nationally, what's your philosophy on bail?
I think it's important to understand South Dakota law says that a judge considers, when they're setting the bond or the bail, is this going to make them appear? Are they going to appear or are they a danger to the community or others? So that's what the judge is thinking about. Do they have a history of failing to appear? If I'm in front of that judge and I say, Judge, this person has failed to appear 10 times before. They're not coming to court unless you set some sort of bond. Maybe they'll have that financial interest. Maybe they'll be held in custody. The danger to others, I think some of that should also be considered as the danger to themselves, right? We don't want this person to, who keeps getting arrested for methamphetamine use, like back to back to back to back. Maybe they're going to, harm themselves if they continue to use it. But those are the things that are considered. One of the things that I did prior when I was prosecuting is at the end of the week, I'd look and see, okay, here's all the people that we have in custody. Here's what their bond was set at. Are there people that should be let out of custody? Should I ask the judge to redress that bond?
Yeah.
Defense attorneys can do that as well. So if the system's working well, you can have further review on bond, and that does happen quite a bit. The problem is when you have someone who's being held because they're a danger to someone else, a week later, has that danger subsided? Maybe not. Maybe they've had time to cool off. I think that's one of the reasons why there's the mandatory arrest for domestic situations.
Yeah.
Law enforcement doesn't have the discretion there. They have to place a person under arrest if they think that a domestic assault happened. That person has to stay in custody until they see the judge. Sometimes there can be a cooling off that's good. Sometimes that can have profound effect on people's lives, right? They don't show up to work the next day.
Yeah.
That can affect them, but that's what the law is. I think it's important to make sure that we're applying that bond and that bail setting in a just manner. I think that the judges do that. I have no complaints against them. But I also have to make sure as a state's attorney, I'm telling the judge important things, making sure that that person has a chance to tell the judge what they want the judge to know before that's set. If they have a defense attorney, they can relay that. The individual defendant, can tell the judge, if I don't get out tonight, I'll lose my job. So the judge can consider that. And it's not an easy task, right? Because the judge doesn't want to let someone else be harmed because they let that person out. It's also an expense to taxpayers if that person isn't showing up for court and we have to send law enforcement to arrest them, bring them to court. That can also be a dangerous situation for law enforcement.
Yeah.
There's a lot that goes into it. Certainly there are people that have been held when they didn't have to. There have been people that have been let go when they probably should have been held. It's a tough topic.
It's important for people to understand, though, a majority of charges that we come into contact people with are PR bonds, or they're out, or they're a PR bond the next day by judge when they make their first appearance at 1:30. So, for example, if you get caught with a small amount of marijuana, right, there's not a huge bond. It's a PR bond. Like there's a lot of offenses that aren't come through, but as he stated, there are some people that really make us nervous because this was a pretty violent assault, and they're in jail for 2 weeks, and all of a sudden the bond gets reduced, and now we're like, okay, well, what's the impact on this victim? What's down there? But I think again, the national conversation is pretty interesting. I read some of these stories, and I'm like, wow, that's really interesting how they do that there.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
And that's why I always want to be careful not to have you guys answering for what other people are doing, because these things are not necessarily prevalent here or may have revealed themselves as an issue, but we just know the opportunity for it if people are not educated on how these things work and what they expect to see from that. Just before we get out of here, because we have a very short amount of time though, but I did want to circle back on the idea of the conversation piece, because I think that's so important. And can you give us some insight on the training? Because I think because of the conversation, and particularly nationally, the idea of kind of comply or die, right? That after a person doesn't show a level of compliance, anything that happens to that person afterwards is justified. When the very nature of the job is that if you show up, that person was out of compliance of something generally. So when you talk about conversation in terms of being a tool, because authority is a tool, conversation is a tool, just like a taser. And sometimes people reach for the wrong tool too quick. And oftentimes when we're training, people don't necessarily train for that as much. And we do often what we do well. And so if we're conversing more, are we training at that? Are we getting excellent at that? Are we doing best in class work to be good at using that tool? Tell me a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, if the only tool you have is a hammer, then everything's a nail, right? It's the old saying that goes through there. And so part of that complete kit bag, so to speak, is the ability to have conversation to de-escalate. And at times, is that a great option? Yes. At times, is it an option that's not really prevalent? That's the case too. But even in the moments, like even within physical struggles, I've been telling people, we always are preaching them to keep talking, saying, come on, put your hands behind your back, stop resisting. Let's just get this done. Let's get this figured out. But we'd rather have the conversation before we go hands on. And a lot of times when we deal with people, there's pre-indicators and there's certain things we try to do. But again, this is the gift of gab, or the silver tongue, right? The ability to talk to somebody and gain compliance works for some people better than others. But how we're establishing this is, again, use of force. Everyone we do is reviewed. Like the supervisor reviews the video, then his supervisor reviews the video, then the supervisor reviews the video. And we come back with really debriefs or deconstructions of those cases and say, okay, while you did this well and your use of force was justified, here's some things for you to consider. Have you ever noticed how Officer Johnson handled these situations, right?
Yeah.
Officer Johnson does a really good job. Watch his methodology, watch how he approaches people. And we're still coaching and training people to develop better skills. Again, I call it masterclass policing, the 2 to 3 year officer who's still learning to deal with that massive adrenaline dump or that stressful the situation of being, okay, what am I doing in this situation? How am I getting this done? Is still developing those skills, but what are we doing to identify within those and say, okay, you seem to get a little amped up in some situations. So here's some techniques we can use and some communication techniques and kind of walk alongside them and mentor that relationship. I wish there was sometimes people think you can just take a class and be good at something. No.
For sure.
Right? Like you need some coaching, you need some work. And I think it's up to us, again, through these reviews to say, okay, your words probably could have escalated the situation. I know you didn't think they were, but your tone, your tempo and everything maybe didn't breathe calm into the situation. Try this next time. I think sometimes people think cops, we don't want to work too hard to get something done at the end of the day, right? I don't want to go hands-on with you. I want to put the cuffs on you nicely, and I want to get you in the car and get you down. In many cases, you're getting out of county before we're even done with the paperwork, right? But we don't want to have these altercations because they're extremely stressful for us. Like this is not like get a use of force review or getting involved in these situations or getting, it's not something we seek out because at the end of the day, we're human beings too. We would like as minimal stress as possible, not maybe getting these situations that are escalated to that level.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank you guys so much, Lieutenant Thum of SFPD and our new incoming State's Attorney for Minnehaha County,
Thank you.
Daniel Haggar. We appreciate you so much for being here. These are tough questions you guys are answering because these are tough subject matters, but like it really gets me excited, and I'm so proud to be a Rotarian right now for us to be leading in these conversations. And one of the things that, I always want to point out is that, as the Downtown Rotary, we are one of the largest collections of leaders and influencers in the region, and what we are able to do is immense. And so I think it's important that we be able to bring these conversations to all our Rotarians because of the part that we play. And it's also very important that the community at large gets access to these folks. And I think it's important that people know how accessible they are. So I think the common ask is for you to get in the game, for you to participate, for you to follow these conversations. There's so much more that we could talk about. We will talk about. And as I pointed out, we will be growing these conversations as they go with different voices and different elements to the conversation. So we hope that you would view them. Please like, share, and subscribe to the page so you don't miss any of these conversations. You can always follow us on the website or on our social pages. We look forward to having these conversations in the future. We will hope you will tune in for those as well. Thank you so very much and have a great rest of the day.